My name is Melissa Unzueta. I'm 29 years old. The day the truth exploded across national television. My parents nearly fainted on live camera, my twin sister burst into tears, and millions of viewers discovered something I'd spent 20 years trying to understand. What shocked everyone wasn't that I had been abandoned. It was why my parents had chosen my twin sister, Isabella, and left me in foster care when we were 6 years old. For decades, they claimed I was a troubled child they couldn't handle. But hidden documents, sealed records, and one investigative journalist revealed a secret they had buried for years. And the moment that secret became public, their entire world collapsed. Growing up in foster care felt like watching life through a window that never opened. Every birthday reminded me that somewhere out there, my twin sister was celebrating with our parents while I was sleeping in another stranger's house. Every Christmas, I wondered what made me so different from Isabella. We shared the same face, the same birthday, the same blood. Yet somehow she was loved while I was discarded. When I was 12, I finally asked my social worker the question that haunted me every night. Did my parents ever ask about me? She hesitated before answering. That hesitation told me everything. Then she quietly said, "No, Melissa." Not once. I smiled to hide the pain, but later I cried into my pillow until sunrise. No child should ever hear those words. The foster system wasn't entirely cruel. Some families were kind. Some weren't. I learned how to pack my belongings into a single trash bag in under 10 minutes. I learned not to get attached to people because they usually left. Most importantly, I learned that nobody was coming to save me. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. At 18, I aged out of the system with $200, a part-time job, and absolutely no family. Meanwhile, social media occasionally showed me glimpses of Isabella's life, vacations, birthday parties, college acceptance celebrations. My parents looked proud in every photograph. Looking at those pictures felt like being erased over and over again. By 29, I had built a respectable life. I worked as a financial analyst, owned a small condo, and had people who genuinely cared about me. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why me? Why had they kept Isabella and thrown me away? Every record I requested was incomplete. Every official explanation sounded rehearsed. Something wasn't adding up. One Thursday afternoon, everything changed. I received a phone call from a producer of a national investigative television program. At first, I assumed it was a scam. Then she mentioned details about my adoption records that nobody outside government agencies should have known. Her voice was calm but urgent. "Melissa," she said, "we've been investigating your family's history for 8 months. We found documents suggesting your parents weren't telling the truth about why you entered foster care. We think you'd want to see them." The room suddenly felt smaller. My hands began shaking. For 20 years, I had searched for answers. Now someone was telling me they might actually exist. Before I continue, comment below where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. If you enjoy emotional family stories with shocking twists, the producer emailed me copies of records that evening. As I opened the first document, my stomach dropped. One sentence changed everything I thought I knew about my childhood. It proved my parents had lied to everyone, including Isabella. And that was only the beginning. Friday morning arrived, but I barely slept. The documents the producer sent kept replaying in my head. According to the official reports, my parents had told social services that I suffered from severe behavioral problems and posed a danger to my twin sister. Yet every foster record from the following years described me as quiet, respectful, and unusually mature for my age. The two stories couldn't both be true. Someone had lied, and for the first time I had proof. That afternoon, I met the investigative team in their downtown office. The lead journalist spread dozens of files across a conference table. Some came from court archives. Others had been obtained through public records request. As I looked through the stack, one detail immediately stood out. My parents had attended over 30 hearings related to Isabella's education and healthcare. Meanwhile, there wasn't a single record showing they had ever visited me after I entered foster care. I felt a lump forming in my throat as I turned another page. Inside was a statement from a social worker written 23 years earlier. She documented concerns that my parents were showing extreme favoritism toward one child while neglecting the other. Several recommendations for family counseling had been ignored. The case notes described repeated warnings. Yet somehow no one had stepped in strongly enough to protect me. Reading those words felt like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. Then the journalist handed me a sealed copy of a court transcript. "This is where things get strange," he said quietly. My eyes scanned the pages until I found a section highlighted in yellow. A medical specialist had testified that there was no evidence I suffered from any behavioral disorder. In fact, the doctor specifically recommended that both twins remain together whenever possible. My parents had received that recommendation and rejected it. I sat frozen in my chair. For 20 years, I believed there had been something wrong with me. Every rejection, every lonely birthday, every painful foster placement had been built on that assumption. Now I was learning that professionals had actually advised my parents not to separate us. They ignored the advice anyway. The realization hit harder than any truth I'd ever faced. That evening, I drove home in complete silence. The city lights blurred through my windshield as memories surfaced one after another. I remembered being 6 years old and standing beside Isabella in matching jackets. I remembered holding her hand in the social services office. Most clearly, I remembered my mother kneeling in front of me and saying, "Be brave for your sister." At the time, I thought we'd be reunited soon. I never saw them again. Over the next week, the investigation intensified. The producers interviewed former teachers, neighbors, social workers, and even distant relatives. Every new interview added another piece to the puzzle. Several witnesses described Isabella as the clear favorite from birth. Family members recalled my parents constantly praising her while criticizing me. One aunt admitted she had questioned the treatment for years, but was threatened with being cut off from the family if she spoke up. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The investigative team located my biological grandmother, a woman I hadn't seen since childhood. She was 82 years old and living quietly in another state. When the producers interviewed her, she revealed a secret she had carried for decades. According to her, my father had become convinced shortly after our birth that I wasn't his biological daughter. There was no evidence. No test, just suspicion. The journalist showed me the recorded interview. My grandmother's voice trembled as she spoke. She explained that my father treated Isabella like a princess, but viewed me as a reminder of a betrayal he imagined had happened. My mother knew his accusations were false, but instead of defending me, she chose to protect her marriage. Hearing those words felt like the floor disappearing beneath me. My entire childhood had been destroyed because of a lie. The producers immediately ordered DNA testing using preserved records and legal documentation. The results arrived 2 weeks later. They confirmed what my grandmother had always known. I was absolutely my father's biological daughter. There had never been any doubt. The accusation that destroyed my life was completely fabricated. My parents had sacrificed one child to preserve a story that was never true in the first place. As preparations for the television special began, I wondered what Isabella knew. Had she been told the truth? Had she believed the lies too? Part of me was angry. Another part remembered the little girl who used to hold my hand. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents. Now I wasn't sure what I would say, because some betrayals are so deep that words stop being enough. Before we move to the next, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The biggest revelation was still ahead, and it was about to happen on live national television. The week before the television special aired felt unreal. The producers kept gathering evidence, and every new discovery seemed worse than the last. What shocked me most wasn't the cruelty itself anymore. It was how carefully my parents had protected their image while doing it. To neighbors, church friends, and coworkers, they were known as loving parents who had suffered the heartbreak of losing a troubled child. Behind closed doors, they had created that narrative themselves. 3 days before filming, the producers arranged a private meeting between Isabella and me. I hadn't seen my twin sister in more than 20 years. My hands trembled as I entered the conference room. When she walked through the door, it felt like looking into a mirror that had lived an entirely different life. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other, trying to process the years we had lost. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Melissa, I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know." Her voice cracked as she explained that our parents had spent years telling her I had chosen to stay away. They claimed I hated the family and wanted nothing to do with them. Every time she asked questions, they gave her the same answer. Eventually, she stopped asking because she believed there was no point. I wanted to be angry. Part of me had carried resentment toward her for years. She had the birthdays, the family vacations, the graduation celebrations, and the unconditional love. Meanwhile, I had foster homes and uncertainty. But as she sat across from me crying, I realized something important. She had been manipulated too. Not in the same way, but she had spent her life trapped inside their lies just as I had. The producers then showed Isabella the documents. I watched her expression change as she read each page. First confusion, then disbelief, then horror. By the time she reached the DNA results, she was openly sobbing. "They told me Dad was protecting the family," she said. "They told me you were dangerous." Hearing those words made me physically sick. Our parents hadn't just abandoned me. They had poisoned my sister's understanding of me for decades. After the meeting, Isabella asked if we could talk alone. We spent nearly 4 hours sharing pieces of our lives. She told me about her college years, her marriage, and the pressure of constantly being expected to be perfect. I told her about foster care, working multiple jobs, and learning how to survive without anyone. We laughed occasionally, but there was sadness beneath every conversation. Neither of us could recover the childhood we should have shared. The day of filming arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The studio was larger than I expected. Producers rushed through hallways carrying notes and equipment. Makeup artists adjusted cameras and lighting. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in a dressing room trying to calm my nerves. In a few hours, the truth would become public. There would be no taking it back. Once those secrets reached millions of viewers, my parents' carefully constructed image would disappear forever. My parents arrived separately from Isabella and me. Through a monitor backstage, I watched them greet audience members with confident smiles. They looked relaxed because they believed they were attending an interview about family reconciliation. The producers had intentionally withheld the investigation's findings. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't control the narrative. They were about to hear the truth at the same moment as everyone else. The host began with simple questions. She asked about our family history, my years in foster care, and the supposed behavioral issues that led to my removal. My father answered smoothly, repeating the same story he had told for decades. My mother nodded beside him while pretending to wipe away tears. Watching them perform for the audience felt surreal. The lies sounded polished from years of repetition. Then the host introduced the investigative findings. The atmosphere changed immediately. Large screens behind the stage displayed court records, social worker reports, and medical evaluations. One by one, the documents contradicted everything my parents had claimed. The audience grew silent. My father's confident expression slowly faded. My mother gripped her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. The final blow came when the DNA results appeared on the screen. The host calmly explained that extensive testing had confirmed I was unquestionably my father's biological daughter. There had never been any evidence supporting his suspicions. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Then the cameras focused on my parents' faces. The look of panic was impossible to hide. As millions watched across the country, my father realized the story he had spent 23 years protecting had just collapsed. But the most devastating revelation had not yet been shown. Hidden among the investigation files was evidence that would expose not only what my parents had done to me, but what they had secretly done with money that legally belonged to me. The studio remained completely silent after the DNA results appeared on the screen. My father looked as if he couldn't decide whether to speak or run. My mother kept shaking her head while whispering that there had to be some mistake. But the host wasn't finished. She calmly explained that the investigation had uncovered financial records connected to a trust fund established by my grandfather shortly before his death. The audience leaned forward as the details began unfolding. According to the documents, my grandfather had left identical inheritance funds for both Isabella and me. The money wasn't enormous, but it was enough to help both of us start adult life with security. The trust was designed so neither child could access the funds until turning 25. However, investigators discovered that shortly after I entered foster care, legal paperwork was filed that transferred control of my portion to my parents under the claim that I could not be located. At first, I struggled to understand what I was hearing. Then the host displayed copies of bank statements and court filings. The evidence showed that over the years, thousands of dollars from my inheritance had been withdrawn and used for family expenses, vacations, and private school tuition. Not my tuition, Isabella's. Every sacrifice I had made while working double shifts and sleeping in tiny apartments suddenly took on a different meaning. The help that had been intended for me had been quietly stolen. My father immediately tried to defend himself. He claimed the funds had been used for the benefit of the family. He insisted everything had been legal. But the producers had anticipated that argument. A legal expert explained that several withdrawals appeared, highly questionable and potentially violated the original terms of the trust. The audience could feel the tension growing. For the first time all evening, my father had no convincing answer. Then came the moment that changed everything. The host asked me if I wanted to say anything. For years, I had imagined screaming at my parents. I had imagined exposing them, humiliating them, and making them feel the same pain they caused me. But as I looked at them sitting across the stage, I felt surprisingly calm. Anger had carried me through many difficult years. Now I no longer needed it. I took a deep breath and looked directly at them. For most of my life, I said, I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I wasn't good enough to be loved. Tonight, I learned that wasn't true. My voice remained steady even though my heart was pounding. The problem was never me. The problem was two adults who chose lies over responsibility. The audience erupted into applause. My parents stared at me in complete shock. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't crying. I wasn't giving them the emotional reaction they expected. Instead, I was simply stating facts. Years earlier, they had controlled every part of my story. Now they couldn't interrupt, manipulate, or rewrite anything. The truth was speaking for itself. After the broadcast ended, producers escorted everyone backstage. My parents immediately tried approaching me. My mother was crying uncontrollably. My father looked exhausted and defeated. For a moment, I considered listening. Then I remembered 23 years of silence. 23 years without a phone call, a birthday card, or even a simple apology. Their need to explain suddenly felt far less important than my need for peace. My mother reached for my hand. "Melissa, please let us explain," she begged. Her voice sounded desperate. I gently stepped backward. "I've spent my entire life listening to your explanations," I replied. The documents explained everything already. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply true. For the first time, there was nothing left to argue about. A week later, my attorney filed civil claims related to the trust fund. Additional agencies began reviewing the financial records uncovered during the investigation. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post online. I didn't give interviews attacking my parents. Quiet revenge isn't loud. It doesn't require public humiliation. It simply allows consequences to arrive naturally after the truth becomes impossible to hide. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Isabella called me almost every day. We began rebuilding a relationship neither of us had been allowed to have. We shared childhood memories, compared old photographs, and slowly started becoming sisters again. The bond wasn't perfect. Too much time had been lost for that. But for the first time since we were 6 years old, we were finally on the same side. Before moving into the final chapter, like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Because while the television special exposed my parents' lies, the final part is about what happened afterward and why my parents' biggest shock came months after the cameras stopped rolling. 3 months after the television special aired, my life looked completely different. The media attention slowly faded, but the consequences of the investigation continued growing. Financial reviews uncovered additional irregularities connected to the trust fund. Legal proceedings moved forward quietly through the courts. Meanwhile, I returned to work and focused on rebuilding a normal routine. For the first time in years, I wasn't searching for answers. I already had them. The strangest part was how peaceful I felt. People often assume revenge brings excitement or satisfaction. In reality, the most powerful feeling was relief. I no longer carried the burden of wondering why my parents abandoned me. The mystery that had haunted every stage of my life was finally solved. Their rejection had never been a reflection of my worth. It was the result of their choices, their fears, and their dishonesty. One afternoon, my attorney called with an update. A settlement proposal had arrived from my parents' legal team. They wanted to avoid a lengthy public court battle. The offer included financial compensation, repayment of disputed trust assets, and several other terms. My lawyer asked if I wanted to negotiate further. I thought about it for a long moment before giving my answer. The money mattered, but it wasn't the most important part anymore. I accepted a revised agreement that required full repayment and written acknowledgement of the facts established during the investigation. Some people expected me to demand harsher punishment. Others wanted dramatic courtroom confrontations. But that wasn't what I needed. I had spent too much of my life being controlled by their decisions. Freedom meant refusing to let them control my future as well. Closure became more valuable than conflict. Several weeks later, a letter arrived from my mother. It was 6 pages long. She apologized repeatedly and admitted she had chosen protecting her marriage over protecting her daughter. Reading those words was painful because they confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't failed to understand what was happening. She understood perfectly and remained silent. Some truths hurt more because they remove every possible excuse. A separate letter arrived from my father. Unlike my mother's, it contained very little emotion. He admitted his suspicions had been wrong and acknowledged the DNA results. Yet, even then, parts of the letter felt distant and defensive. As I finished reading, I realized something important. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. I could eventually forgive them without allowing them back into my life. The decision became clear a few days later. I changed my phone number, updated my contact information, and instructed my attorney to handle any future communication. There was no dramatic announcement. No angry social media post. No final argument. I simply closed the door. After years of chaos, silence felt like a gift. The people who had once controlled every chapter of my childhood no longer had access to my future. Meanwhile, my relationship with Isabella continued growing stronger. We began celebrating birthdays together and creating memories that should have existed decades earlier. One evening, we sat on my balcony watching the sunset. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then she quietly asked, "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we had grown up together?" I smiled sadly because I had wondered that thousands of times. Sometimes I admitted. But then, I remember that we're here now. She nodded and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I realized my parents had spent years trying to separate us, yet the truth had ultimately brought us back together. The bond they tried to destroy had survived anyway. It wasn't the childhood we deserved, but it was a future we could still build. Nearly a year after the broadcast, I received one final surprise. The television program won a major investigative journalism award. During the acceptance speech, the host mentioned how exposing hidden family injustices can change lives. Watching from my living room, I felt emotional for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The story was no longer just about betrayal. It was about survival, accountability, and truth finally reaching the surface. If there's one lesson I learned from everything that happened, it's this. Sometimes the people who hurt you most expect you to spend your life chasing their approval. They expect your pain to keep you connected to them forever. The greatest revenge is refusing to play that role. The greatest victory is building a life so full of peace that their choices no longer define you. My parents chose my twin sister and left me in foster care. For years, they convinced everyone that I was the problem. Then, national television revealed what they had hidden, and the lies collapsed under their own weight. They lost the image they spent decades protecting. I gained the truth I spent decades searching for. And in the end, that made all the difference.